Welcome back to Restored Gospel Podcast. I'm Michael Barrett, here with my brother.
I'm Corey Stark.
We're friends having casual conversation about the things of eternity. We welcome you into that conversation. Corey, I got some more exciting things to share today. Gaddianton Robbers, one of those things. Remember, I was driving one day listening to the radio, and this thought popped into my mind about the Gaddianton Robbers, and I sent you a text and said, hey, have you ever looked up the Hebrew meaning of that word? Because it seems like a made up, I've never heard that word before other than the Book of Mormon. And I think maybe you're going to share a little bit about that today and some other exciting things. So, brother, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, it's exciting in a Gentile kind of way. I was thinking about this morning. Well, two things. One is, we love to read the mail, and we get people who are interested and sometimes fascinated by the things we share, and for some reason we get a lot of mail from haters too. That maybe is too strong a word, but people who object or challenge what we're sharing, and it's kind of interesting. The sources of those people are people from usually deep in the Restoration who you'd think would embrace all this, but anything that seems to challenge what they perceive as the Joseph Smith influence is it seems to be viewed negatively. And all we're doing is sharing what the Book of Mormon says. And Joseph Smith was the translator, but I think people put him up to all these other tasks later that he wasn't really given by God to do. Nevertheless, one of the criticisms recently, Mike, and you shared this with me, was someone said, well, the changes in the Book of Mormon are because God somehow authorized Joseph Smith to make changes after the original edition. And well, of course, there have been verses added and chapters added and things like that, none of which came with the original words. All we really got were words. When we read punctuation and things like that, that's all things that we Gentiles added to make it easier to read for us. But some of those very things take away from the meaning. And so on this little point here, we'll kind of get into these slides. This is sorry, I'm a little unorganized here. Give me just a second to get my screen up. This is more on AI and some of the things that maybe were changed unnecessarily. So in the LDS Book of Mormon, Helaman 2:4 talks about there was one Gaddianton who was exceeding expert in many words, also his craft. And if you read also in the 1908, the RLDS version, it says there was one Gaddianton and same word for word verse, even same word for word Gaddianton. Now, if you read in the RCE, this is interesting. And you can see these side by side, RLDS and the LDS version. And when I say RLDS, the 1908 version is what the church has embraced for over 100 years as the standard Book of Mormon. We never had any thought to read anything else. We just assumed it was all exactly as the original. But when you read in the RCE, this is interesting. There was one Gaddianton, and if you notice, the spelling is different. In the RCE, there's 2 Ds versus in the LDS and the RLDS is 1 D. So the RCE came first. Now, did God authorize Joseph Smith to change that? And it's kind of a funny question because no, he didn't. But for some reason, the spelling of the word evolved. And you think, well, what does the spelling matter? Maybe it doesn't, because these are all just kind of English words that have been phonetically manipulated to give us an idea of a name. So I start here with just the spelling difference in the RCE versus the LDS. But what's more is when you get into it, so here's all 3 of them. Gaddianton is 1 D in LDS and RLDS, and it's 2 Ds in RCE.
I'll just say for our new listeners that may have not heard, the RCEs, the Restored Covenant Edition, came out in the 90s after a lot of work comparing the original manuscript, printer's manuscript, going back to the original printing of the Book of Mormon and correcting those changes to be as close and to follow the original very first printing of the Book of Mormon.
Exactly. And it's the closest thing we have to the original manuscript. And they're still finding little edits. In 2023, they being the Book of Mormon Foundation, came up with about 15 other little words that got changed slightly. But you're thinking, okay, what's the big deal? So I put this to AI and I said, does the word Gaddianton in the Book of Mormon have any Hebrew meaning? Just ask the simple question. And what's interesting is how it responded. So I'm using an AI tool called Grok. There's several of them out there. I like Grok because it seems to be the least biased politically, spiritually, whatever. Just tries to give the facts. Um, so it points out that the original manuscript had two Ds. The printer's manuscript later was two Ds. The 1830 edition had two Ds, but the later edition, starting about 1837, changed the spelling. And what's interesting is it makes this point: the double D spelling is critical for the Hebrew connection. Now, I'm going to get into the whole meaning of the word, but I want to start here to show how the RCE tries to be faithful to the minutia, the differences. And when you put this to AI, they're saying, hey, this subtle change of even just one D in the word is significant. And so we'll get into the meaning of the word now, but it'll come back around to this double D. So it says, if you take the word Gaddianton, it breaks down into this proposed Hebrew etymology, which just means take the word and show what the roots are. And you get this idea of Gaddi, and then this attenton, and then this atenoth. These are the Hebrew words that literally make up Gaddianton. And so they're the real Hebrew words. And if you would transliterate those, it would spell this word, even the word with two D's. But what's interesting is that the word Gaddi in the Hebrew um, was biblical, but we don't really make that connection. It meant of Gad. This Gaddi meant of the tribe of Gad. But what's more is it says it's rare and it's not found in the regular Bible, but this middle root word meant robbers or bandits or highwaymen. So we've got this people of Gad who are robbers or bandits, or highwaymen, like people who would rob the stagecoach, if you will. But this literally meant mercenary or a robber for hire. Isn't that interesting?
Mm.
So this word, when you take it, it didn't appear in the Bible that we have, but it meant robbers and bandits. But it was also in the Dead Sea Scrolls and later rabbinic literature with the same meaning. How would Joseph Smith would have had access to any of that? And not only just aware, access to the words, but understanding of the nuance of this. And so when you look at this word and combine it, you get the robbers of Gad, or a bandit troop with the company of Gad. And it states, and this is all what Grok wrote word for word, this is an almost perfect phonetic and Semitic match for the Book of Mormon's Gaddianton Robbers, a secret society of professional robbers and assassins. Now, without going through all the history, most people, if you've been, acclimated at all the Book of Mormon, you know that the Gaddianton Robbers were the bad guys, and they were the mercenaries. They were the one disrupting the society and tearing things apart. And this meaning of the word in Hebrew is exactly that.
That's fascinating.
It just
I mean, I don't know what critics would say for that. I
how
mean,
do you
how does the
yeah, how do
guy
you
know
criticize that?
down to the spelling, even, right? Even when
Ex-
men tried to mess with it for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it says a little more. So good lead into this next slide. Why the double D matters. In Hebrew, when a word ending in yod is compounded with the following word, the yod often triggers gemination. That means doubling of the next consonant in pronunciation. Now, this is a mouthful of words here, but the whole point is saying when you spell it in Hebrew, it requires two consonants versus one. So even though this is just a phonetic spelling in English, so that we can kind of hear what the word sounds like, the RCE is faithful to the original word. And I wasn't there, but from what we read, when the Book of Mormon was transcribed, taken from the plates, that they being Joseph Smith and the scribe, couldn't go to the next word until the first word was not only written correctly, but spelled correctly. And this was a limitation they had, that they couldn't go on if they even missed the spelling of a word. So this is just fascinating to me. So in the Hebrew, the way these roots are coupled together, when you have this yod after a certain consonant, it requires a doubling of the consonant. So this whole combination of the word Gaddianton would very naturally be pronounced something like Gaddy and Anton, like the English Gaddianton. So even down to the spelling, and this is again, I love my brothers and sisters in the Restoration who kind of feel like, man, they're justified in defending everything Joseph Smith said. But someone got a little blunt, I guess, recently saying, no, Joseph Smith commanded all these things. Well, did he really command, these English words to be changed? You know, even in their spelling? No, people did that. And people just thought they were making things a little easier by respelling things. Well, even the original spellings are closer to the original Hebrew than what we ended up with in the later editions of the Book of Mormon. Isn't that interesting?
Fascinating. Yeah, just one of a growing list of proofs that we've been sharing here that the Book of Mormon is authentic. It's from another time period. It was simply translated by a boy who had no information on any of this.
Exactly. And so, to summarize, this is all Grok, the AI language speaking. In the earliest text of the Book of Mormon, the RCE, spelling Gaddianton Latudes is an exact transliteration of the Hebrew phrase, the Gadite robbers or the robber band troop of Gad, a precise and elegant Semitic pun that describes exactly what they were, a secret combination of professional robbers and murderers. And then it states this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for authentic ancient Hebrew wordplay embedded in the English text of the Book of Mormon. Isn't that interesting? Just by
Yeah.
definition of a word that we would never even think to question, except you happen to bring this question up, Mike, and then we
Yeah.
dug in. Yeah. So, I mean, it's amazing. And I just want to say this, using Grok to kind of prove a point, it doesn't really prove anything. I mean, some people might be intrigued, but the real proof is when your heart changes and you want to put away your sin and you want to be like Jesus. That's when the Book of Mormon has done its work. All these internal authenticities, we're never going to discover them all. We don't have the capability to, and they're there and they exist. And for me, it's kind of a fascinating study. But the real thing comes down to, like you've prayed, Mike, and just saying, Lord, I have a sin problem, and when you confront that in your life and you read the remedy that the Book of Mormon offers, that's when the real change occurs. That's when we can be born again. So, I love this stuff, but I'm not saying it's going to change you. It might intrigue you, but that's kind of where it's at for me.
Well, I like having a body of work and having these things to show people when superficial arguments are brought up against the Book of Mormon. Hopefully someone at some time, maybe considers these things and of the actual text and say, how would a person try to fake this and why? Why
Yep.
would they do so when the whole book speaks of the blood of Jesus? Just and I think for those that believe in the Book of Mormon, to me, every one of these is just it's just more faith strengthening and makes me want to try to, implement more and more the teachings of the book so that I can, have no more desire to sin and be changed in my inner man. Like we see the beautiful stories in this book of people that happened to. It's faith
Exactly.
strengthening to me. It continues to add to the foundation of my faith that I can trust the gospel contained therein.
Exactly. And
Even down to the words in the letter, right? To really
down to the
trust it.
letter.
Not that some man got in there and tried to monkey it up or we lost parts, through the ages. It's just so pristine down to the letter. Yeah.
hmm You know, I love the phrase in the Book of Mormon that states, "Hey, if there are faults," he said, it's the fault of a man." In other words, something man did incorrectly in our frailty, in our finiteness. But he said, "But we know no fault." And in other words, that the ideas that were put forth are all correct, and we can trust in them. And this is something that the church hasn't done. It's like, we're given the Book of Mormon as, oh, this is this cool thing, and the LDS, I think, were faithful for calling it another testament of Jesus, but it wasn't trying to just be another one. It was, for all intents and purposes, right now, of books available, it is the authority in all cases of the books that we can read without fault. And so I'm just thrilled that we've got this, and I love opening it every day to try to learn more about it. And these are little tidbits again, but you're right. There's a couple more words we're going to get to, and I think critics used to point these things out thinking they had a leg to stand on, and trying to criticize the Book of Mormon. And then we, as the supposed faithful, would kind of cower back and not sure how to respond to some of these. But in every case, you can take these things and you can turn them on their head, and AI is helping do that. But again, that isn't the real testimony. The testimony is the change of heart that we'll receive when we see who Jesus is and see how the very eternal God sacrificed his own life so that it could pay the debt of sin. That's the real testimony.
Well, I'm thankful for those that have put work into, tedious hours. That seems like an understatement to go through those original manuscripts, even if it's just restoring a D to a word. Look at where that can then take us, So
Yeah,
thankful for so many that have gone before and tried to keep the Book of Mormon pristine as it came forth originally.
exactly. Now, I'm going to say in putting this little podcast, the slides together, I noticed in these same, I'm going backwards here, in these same verses that we compared from the LDS to the 1908 to the RCE, there was also another word in here, kishkumen. And if you notice how it's spelled in the RCE versus how it's spelled in the LDS and the later 1908, there's a spelling difference there. And so while I had AI open, I thought, well, what about this word? And this is kind of interesting too, going back
It was
forward.
just I got a list of scriptures that Gaddianton's found in the 1908 edition, and I was looking at that Kishkumen and thought, we should we should look that up. So here we go.
Well, the difference is a K or a C, and it's like it doesn't sound different, but it's spelled different. And so I said, the LDS spells it with a K, so did the RLDS. Excuse me, 1908. But the RCE uses a C. What, is there some preferred transliteration of this that ties back to Hebrew? And it states, again, kind of the history of it, how the printer's manuscript, the early manuscript, you just to see, but the RCE is restoring back to the original spelling. But what's interesting is which one is preferred. Says the name is very clearly built on a well-attested Hebrew pattern of Kishkumen with a C, transliterated, and it breaks it down and it shows the root meaning to be hard or severe. This root appears in Hebrew names like Kish, the father of Saul. But so it gets down into the details of Hebrew, and it basically states that other words like the word Camorra, for instance, with a C, it it was properly spelled with a C because of the root words back in. Now, again, it was all written in Hebrew or a form of Hebrew, this Egyptian script. But the point is, it ties in perfectly with other prefix, and this root came from a element meaning a harsh or cruel priest. Now, what it goes on to say uh, is this: it's like using that yod and the double D in Gaddianton. The Hebrew word shin, this word that looks kind of like a flame, is the sh sound. Um, it's almost always translated with a sh in the King James, but the early scribes consistently heard and wrote sh as c when it followed a vowel. So, like coriantumr, the hard k sound is sometimes written k, but it was incorrect. It was done just by scribal error. So it concludes that this word, kishkamin with a C, is the superior restoration because it exactly matches the scribe's earliest attempt to represent the Hebrew, this shin sound after an I, so it becomes a C. So, in other words, all it's trying to do is be faithful to the more appropriate way to spell the word. And again, it doesn't change the meaning or content, but again, these nuances of the RCE simply point back to the exactness that God used in the translation process from this ancient Egyptian script into English. So it says, so if you're trying to get as close as possible to the underlying Hebrew, the RCE spelling kishkumen with a C is not only earlier, it's phonetically more faithful to a name built on the root, and it gives this word meaning harsh or cruel with a common ending. So C is actually the better witness to the original sound. Isn't that interesting? So
Yeah.
again, it's just this is tiny. This is tiny. Who cares if it was a K or C? Probably nobody. But again, it's just showing that the original manuscript was the most faithful wording. So if you can look at something so minor as this, what about big changes where four different times in Nephi's writings he said, Mary was the mother of God, and that God came down to the earth, and those words were changed to Mary was, Jesus was the Son of God, and that the Son of God came down. All those words were inserted later, and they were well after the original manuscript. Well, why was that? Is because the doctrine started shifting under Joseph Smith and other leaders, and they didn't understand what the Book of Mormon had been clearly saying at all, that in order to have an infinite atonement for all eternity, only the infinite one, God himself, could do it. No other person could do that. And so this again has comes back to the larger questions of the Book of Mormon. Why were these things changed? And it's because the Gentiles didn't understand what we have. That's the bottom line. We just didn't get it. So
Corey, do you remember yesterday I sent you a text just on that point you just made about the changes to the to God, or the mother of God, or the mother of the Son of God. I thought it was interesting, and I I said, using AI, if you take the text only of the RCE, what? Oh, I'll just read what I wrote here. When examining this text alone, the single most major overarching theme that dominates the entire Book of Mormon from First Nephi through Moroni is, because I asked it, if you could say one major theme in the Book of Mormon, what would it be? And he said, this is what it is from First Nephi through Moroni, that the Lord Jesus Christ is the eternal God, manifesting himself through covenant to his people in all ages. And it goes on to say a few other things, but there we have it, right? That the Lord Jesus Christ is the eternal God. And so
wow.
then we see those changes where, not that you can't still get that from the rest of the Book of Mormon, but it seemed like low hanging fruit to just kind of change and go along with a more with a different view of who he is, or kind of separating out that idea of God being Jesus, the Father, and the Spirit.
That's beautiful. And that so well summarizes it. To read that statement in so many restoration groups, for instance, you would offend half the people. They would shut you down, they would walk out, they would throw their books down and say, that can't be true, that Jesus is God. And yet the very book that we've been given and are supposedly embracing teaches that very clearly, but it goes against later writings that came out in our church history. And there's a fondness by many people who seem to be scholars within the restoration to want to use our church history as the authority. And it isn't. It's where we began to go astray. And it's only when we come back to the original words and teachings of the Book of Mormon that we can come back to the truth. Um, that's the bottom line.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm glad you took time to look that other word up.
Yeah, it's incidental, but again, it's just kind of, to me, if there are people out there who think, well, Ray Treat, a name who was kind of the leader of this team of people who went back to the original manuscripts, he was respected by most. He could have a sharp personality, and I think that offended some people. But I can see that he was also frustrated by the changes that have been made to the Book of Mormon, and the fact that even without the changes, the majority of our people didn't seem to hold it with any degree of real honor that it deserves. And so, nevertheless, some people called him a rogue or whatever the words were, that he was just kind of off on his own. Wasn't oh I think it, Mike, didn't you read someone said he wasn't sanctioned by the church or something? And it's like, this is the church that all of you people in the restoration left after 1984. What are you talking about trying
Right.
to justify something by sanctioned by the church? Well, I think he was a man. He had a certain amount of wealth. He gave it all to discovering these things in the Book of Mormon, and died, trying to share this truth. So I'm just thankful every day that we have. I appreciate the people who have made it possible for us to hold it in our hands as close to the original. Because every time we get closer to the original, we begin to learn more and more facts that just substantiate its truth.
Yeah, And people on the LDS side have worked, Royal Skousen, I believe that,
Yep.
and there's been a lot of cross integration with the RCE using his body of work too. So
Yep.
thankful for those that care about the original, because it came forth by how the gift and power of God. The translation came forth by the gift and power of God. It says in the Book of Mormon, and so why mess with that? Let's see, let's keep it the way it was and learn from it because it
Yeah.
has purpose.
Exactly. So another Grok question was, what about other names in the Book of Mormon? And this question was specifically, are there other Book of Mormon names that have clear roots in Hebrew? List a few of the more prominent ones. And not it's not necessarily a leading question, it's just a question. And Grok said, here are some of the most prominent and widely accepted Book of Mormon names that have clear, verifiable roots in ancient Hebrew or Northwest Semitic forms. All of these work perfectly with the RCE spellings and the original manuscript readings. Isn't that interesting that it throws that in there? They're presented perfectly, in that text. And now I know it's a little hard to read, but it points out, and this is a few pages of these things, but like the word Mosiah, it's stating. Just a second, I got to make this bigger so I can read it. uh, the exact equivalent of the Hebrew word Messiah. So, but spelled Mosiah. It appears dozens of times in the Old Testament, but the Book of Mormon used it centuries before Jesus as a title for king and deliverers, just like the Old Testament. But there's a little bit more it's going to say on about that in another slide. The word Ammon in Hebrew meant faithful or trustworthy. It was the name of an Egyptian god, but common Hebrew theophoric name element. It appears in the Bible, but it's used in a minor way. This Amon, Ammoniha, it's Ammon is Yahweh, or faithful is Yah, faithful is God. Classic Hebrew theophoric name pattern, same as Isaiah, which is Yesa Yehu, or Yahweh has saved. Zoram meant their rock, and it comes from these Hebrew words sur and aim. He has poured forth Zaram. The roots in the Hebrew, the roots both attest to the Hebrew, very common biblical pattern. Now I'm going to throw a couple of these out. Then I want to talk about the significance. There's more. Remember when uh, the people came back to Zarahemla and they gave them land, and it was the land of their inheritance. And they call it in the Book of Mormon Jershon. Well, literally in Hebrew, it means place of inheritance or possession. Who would have known that? It's from the root to inherit. It exactly matches another place found in Joshua. Zarahemla was a seed of compassion, but these words are rare, and they're not. It's not a biblical word. You don't find it anywhere. But put together, it's a perfect Hebrew word. Cumorah. This was interesting. Literally means the hill of priesthood. The standard biblical Hebrew word for pagan, later priest, perfectly fits a hill sacred to the Nephites, though. So again, it sounded like a made-up name, but it has roots in Hebrew. Riplah, exact biblical Hebrew name in Judah. I can't say it right. Rephaim Valley. I think it's like Ephraim, which we say Ephraim. It's Ephraim. Rephaim Valley area. More words: Laman and Lemuel, Nephi. Uh, in one translation, it means jawbone, but it more deeply meant expounder of truth. But this is interesting. It's extremely common in the Egyptian, but it works both in Hebrew, but you never have that name anywhere in the Bible. But yet it's a word that works in the Hebrew and it works in the Egyptian just as well. And remember, this Nephi, obviously probably the most famous person besides Jesus in the Book of Mormon. He departed Jerusalem with his family under Lehi at the time when the written Hebrew language, was still Egyptian script. They brought the language that had been theirs. It wasn't until um, the Jews and all of Israel were taken captive in Babylon for 70 years, and then they came back out, that their language began to change into what we have as these block characters now. So Nephi would have been a very common name among people who still lived under the Egyptian naming conventions. And again, how would someone have known that? How would they just pick a name out like that that doesn't exist in the Bible? This one's interesting. A lot of critics have said Alma, and they
King
just kind of,
James.
that's a young woman, like alma mater. What school did you go to? Your alma mater. That's a feminine name. Alma is feminine, but it wasn't until the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bar Kokhba letters that we find there was an Alma son of Yehuda, which is Alma son of Judah. That again, it's like the Book of Mormon isn't ever trying to say, it doesn't ever say, hey, my name's Alma, I'm a guy, even though there's a girl's name. It doesn't say it. It just uses the name. How how would someone dare to use a name like that? Because the only understanding Gentiles had of this name was that it was a woman's name. And here another famous man, he's the most prolific writer in the Book of Mormon, has this name, which was indeed a man's name. We went
That's
through.
that's
Go
crazy,
ahead.
Cor I mean, that what just a plain, that's just a my mind's blown, right? I mean, I always look at it from the skeptic's viewpoint. This boy's, this young boy or a group of people have conspired to make this book for whatever reason, and that doesn't even make sense. But using a popular name that or a name that would be a feminine name at the time, like if you and I were writing a book and we named a male character Karen or Christine or
Yeah.
something, right? I mean, we wouldn't do that. That would be like, hey, this obviously is made up here, buddy.
Yeah, and for centuries, this has been the criticism. Alma's made up. You got that wrong, Joe. And it's like, no, it was a man's name, and it's been proven, but not in the Bible.
Yeah.
Let me jump ahead. So Grok put all these together. I just literally copied and pasted from Grok for this stuff, but it's it makes a summary. These are not vague similarities. They are exact matches in morphology, phonology, and meaning with attested Hebrew and sometimes Egyptian names from Lehi's era, the 7th century BC or earlier. The density of these names is one of the strongest internal evidences for the Book of Mormon's claim to be of ancient Semitic origin. Um, again, I look at all these critics for years, and we were just kind of quiet when they would make these criticisms. They would scoff at it and then move on, but it's the scoffing has been wrong. And so, and then I asked this question: so how difficult would it have been to guess these names and place them in the Book of Mormon and get them Hebraically correct? And Grok says it's extremely difficult, bordering on impossible, for an uneducated 23-year-old farmer in New York to have done this. And then, so this is what it begins to say about these names that I just gave you. It says, for instance, Mosiah, the spelling Mosiah, not Messiah, looks like a deliberate, archaic, or dialectical form. Almost no one in 1829 America knew that the original Hebrew pronunciation was Messiah with a long I sound. No one knew that. That's what that name meant. It wasn't being taught in schools or churches or anything like that. Alma as a man's name. The only famous Alma was the Latin alma mater, or a very rare female given names. No one in America knew that Alma was a common Jewish name in the Second Temple period, proven only in the 20th century by the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Bar Kokhba letters. Gaddianton, this requires knowing an obscure Hebrew word for robber or bandit. And again, it wasn't documented in any Western books until decades later. Camorra, this word for idolatrous priest, appears only 5 times in the King James and is translated as priest or idolatrous priest, but no lexicon, no dictionary was available to Joseph Smith connecting that to a place or a hill or priesthood. Again, we mentioned this Jerishon, place of inheritance. Um, it's never used in the King James version this way, but it's coincidentally the very name for inheritance or inheritance land. So it's interesting because they say we're going to call this the land of Jerishon, and they just give this name, but it literally meant land of inheritance, which is what it was in the Book of Mormon. Zarahemla uses 2 biblical nouns. No one in 1829 would have known how to bring these together in this way. Uh, and it goes through all these other words, and I won't read them all just for time, but it just states that almost every name follows an exact late Bronze, Iron Age, Northwest Semitic naming convention. And all these endings and everything like that weren't taught anywhere in the 1820s in America. So how do you get so many of these things right? How if you were just guessing at them? I couldn't get one right. I would just give them names like Bob and Bill. It's like,
Mhm.
but this is again the book that we have that's been criticized for 200 years, and yet it's true on every level, even down to a name.
A lot of research that wasn't available would have had to gone into doing this.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, it goes back to these things that these weren't just random names. They follow the rule of the Bible, but they notice it says they follow the same linguistic rules as the Bible, but they're not found in the Bible itself. So the probability that someone in 1829 could have produced dozens of brand new names that one perfectly obey the Hebrew grammar, two use rare or previously misunderstood vocabulary, and three have only been vindicated by archaeological and linguistic discoveries decades or even centuries later is for all practical purposes zero. The probability that someone could have done this. And so I hope we can tell the world these things, at least maybe for some critics, it would cause them to want to reconsider. I know a few of the podcast listeners have considered Jonathan Cahn, who's pretty popular in the Christian evangelical Jewish circles because he lives here in America. He believes in Jewish things. He believes in Jesus, and they've tried to give him a Book of Mormon. And so she did that too. She actually went to his church temple where he teaches, met his wife. He wasn't there, I guess, at the time, wanted to share the Book of Mormon. And his wife, Jonathan Cahn's wife, said she would give him the book and that he would respond. Well, what he sent, he emailed her back a couple weeks later and said, "Thanks for sharing the Book of Mormon, but this is why I can't believe it." And I don't think he actually opened the Book of Mormon. What he shared was just a copy and paste of standard stuff that's out on the internet, uh, things like these that, are the AI now is turning on its head. How can you have this name of a female person in Alma, things like that. But those are the common criticisms that people have been using for forever. He didn't share anything that was unique. He was just literally kind of go along with the crowd and throwing out all these things about Mormonism that seem to be the general response when someone talks about the Book of Mormon. They'll talk about things about Mormonism, and they really don't know the Book of Mormon. And so some of these things I think could be used in response to these people saying, "Hey, look at the real meanings of these names. It's not what you think." And maybe Jonathan Cahn would pay attention to this at some point in time. But so here's one. It's not a name, but it's just a word. It's been long criticized as being out of place. A French word, literally, in this ancient text. What does AI say about this? And so this is an interesting one because per Grok, it just says, "Hey, critics point out that ado is way out of place. A French word in a supposed Hebrew book." Um, but they make this point. Jacob is not ending his writing. He's making a profound final plea for his readers to come to Christ with the implicit consequence of being eternally separated from God if they don't. So that's what he's saying. Hey, if you don't follow these things, I'm not going to see you again. So it makes this statement, which in Hebrew, it's Lahai Ot La Olam, which can be translated as "see you later forever." So, in other words, the phrase that he's getting at through the word adieu is literally in Hebrew, "see you later, but forever," and which might seem paradoxical. It's kind of like when the chief of the Nez Perce Indians said, "I will fight no more forever." Uh, that phrase, actually, "no more forever," comes from the Book of Mormon. But nevertheless, it seems like he's saying, "Hey, I'm going to see you, but I'm not going to see you forever," or "goodbye forever." So it goes through and it shares this Hebrew phrase, which implies this very thing, this word right here. And in Hebrew thought, this word or the phrase carried deeper spiritual meaning in the even though it's a very concrete language. So the finality of Jacob's message needed a word that could summarize his whole feeling, because he's saying, if you don't come to Christ, we're not going to see you again, basically is his conclusion. So Grot comes in and says, adieu in French means to God, or until we meet in God's presence, which inherently suggests this final farewell. And so he says, while English does not have a direct word for the specific Hebrew concept, adieu captures the essence of Jacob's message in several ways. Now, I'm going to slow down here. This is important because the whole point was English didn't have a single word to capture the meaning of this, that he was trying to say goodbye forever. We don't ever say that. We just say goodbye or see you later. But in the what we call French, that word does summarize that. It's a final goodbye. And so when Nephi finishes his words, he uses a farewell sort of term in the same way. He's sort of signing off and saying, hey, we're going to meet you at God's judgment seat. Farewell. Jacob's doing the same sort of thing, but he's doing it in a way to suggest that there is no meeting up again, if you will, for good reasons, if you don't obey Jesus' command, that we're going to be separated forever. And so it goes through and it explains that it was a grave, it was a very significant word in the Hebrew that could only be expressed with this single word, adieu. And this is all AI explaining that. And so it finally states, its use does not necessarily imply a modern insertion. It wasn't just inserting a word, but rather a selection of a word known for its evocative power and finality. So in other words, it's saying it's the only word that would fit in that meaning.
And I would not have known, other than studying this, I knew the word adieu. It's very much used in our, not so much in our culture now, but it has been in our history books and everything. And I just thought it was a French word for goodbye. I bid you adieu, or I bid you farewell, but not knowing the actual breakdown of the definition on how significant that is, especially the finality in the message in the Book of Mormon of, this is the time to perform our labors, and just that finality that, if there's no repentance, then this is the final goodbye. And and then it's such a silly argument. They say, well, it's a French word, and well, it's a translation. The Book of Mormon is a translation. And the English language has words borrowed from different cultures, and so it's using a word that fit, as you've shown here very clearly.
Well, this is interesting because, just like you said, and this is Grok's response. By the time Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon, adieu was well integrated into English.
There you are.
And so this is like, it's not just grabbing a foreign word. Everyone understood, like you said, some meaning of adieu, but it had a finality to it that maybe didn't come across in the way we use it.
Right.
So again, there's so much depth in these words, and these things have been criticized for years, and we had no response. But AI can pick through this and find the meanings of words, and to me, it's just fascinating. So this wasn't an anachronistic error. In other words, hey, he pulled a word out of time and put it in the wrong spot. But it said it was an astute translation choice that conveys the intended weight and solemnity of Jacob's final words. What you just said is true, Mike, that the right words were chosen for the translation for us to understand in the English language. But what's interesting to me is that even though the words are translated even down to the letter in the ways that best fit the Hebrew meaning, that in pretty much all cases where there's a Hebrew idiom, it's not often explained. And the difference is, we make a phrase like bite the bullet. Well, we know what to bite is, and we know what a bullet is, but the meaning doesn't have anything to do with, clenching your teeth on an explosive. It has a different meaning. And we get that because we understand our culture. Well, in the Book of Mormon, the cultural aspect of these phrases is still maintained. And there's a lot of idioms that aren't necessarily broken down. There are some, and when it's broken down, it's done in a parallelism where it'll say, hey, I said this, but I'll speak in other words, or it'll give a statement, it'll say, or rather, and it'll explain it. Those are instances in the Book of Mormon where it's using a Hebrew idiom. One of them that's fascinating to me is where it talks about in the last days, and then it says, or in the days of the Gentiles. And so what it's doing is explaining that the biblical use of the word last days simply meant the days of the Gentiles. It didn't necessarily mean the very end of time. And this is an interesting idiom that's used because this is why in the book of Acts, they read from the prophet Joel and they make this statement, hey, it's the last days. And we're reading this, 2000 later saying, no, we're in the last days. These guys were wrong. But we Gentiles are wrong because they knew this phrase, for instance, the first shall be last, the last shall be first, to mean the days of the Jews and the days of the Gentiles. And they're simply saying it's the days of the Gentiles. But we don't get that connection without the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon is where that's explained. And this is, again, an instance of an idiom that does get explanation. But if we don't pick up on that, we can misinterpret the meanings of these words. So anyhow, there's a lot of fascinating things about that. But this is kind of how I'd like to conclude this today. And this is something that just jumped out recently. The Lord's Prayer. Jesus' words in the Book of Mormon are often criticized as simply lifted, plagiarized, whatever word you want to use, from the Bible. Is that really true? A lot of critics out there will take the Book of Mark and they'll show long paragraphs of Jesus' words and say, see, it's exactly as Mark. But look a little closer. If you read the Lord's Prayer from the King James, it's, as we've all heard, after this manner, therefore pray ye, our Father which is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. I always liked this as a child. I remember this, the kind of the rhythmic aspect. It sort of rhymed, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Those words always stuck with me. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forget our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. So, and note, we all know this in the inspired version, lead us not into temptation is done differently in Matthew. It says, suffer us not to be led. So that's how we like to read it in the earliest church. Suffer us not to be led into temptation. This lead us not just feels harsh, right? But that's how the King James read. And notice this, the Book of Mormon has the Lord's Prayer. Jesus states it. He begins with the same words. After this manner, therefore, pray ye, our Father which is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. So just looking at this, does anything jump out at you that's any different?
Well, it's missing, give us our daily bread.
Yep. And it's also missing this thy kingdom come. There's two elements of this that are missing. I'll call it missing because we know the King James first, and it's just about the same in the inspired version, except we say, and suffer us not to be led. So you can almost say there's three things different in our LDS tradition anyhow. But yeah, it's missing this phrase, thy kingdom come and give us this day our daily bread. So I asked Grok, I said, take a look at the King James and take a look at the RCE and tell me if there are any ancient biblical texts that also are missing these phrases, right? And so, and I also told it, ignore punctuation. Sometimes you just have to spell things out specifically. But my question is, are there any biblical manuscripts that have a similar reading omitting these phrases like the RCE does? And it goes through and it says, thy kingdom come is omitted in some Luke 11 witnesses. It lists some old manuscripts, but it's not in Matthew. So it's interesting. One book has it one way, one book has it another way in ancient manuscripts. The bread petition is omitted only in a few very late Luke manuscripts, never in Matthew. So Luke, in some old translations, is missing these things. But then it said, but no single manuscript has both omissions plus the doxology. So the point it's making is that if you look in certain manuscripts, you can find thy kingdom come is missing. If you look in other manuscripts, you can find give us this day our daily bread is also missing. But there's not one single biblical manuscript out there that has both of those phrases omitted. Yet the RCE does. Now, why would Joseph Smith not have copied the King James word for word? So I said, so if you assume, and this is my question, that the Book of Mormon is indeed a translation of certain biblical text as it may have originally existed, then does this suggest harmony with the earliest biblical manuscripts in omitting these verses? Now, Grok is very honest and said, no, the earliest and best manuscripts of both Matthew and Luke include these certain phrases. So the RCE does the opposite. It's coming up with its own stating of it that doesn't exist the way it's in the RCE anywhere in any known manuscript. And I thought that's pretty significant. So then I said, okay, just for my benefit, list the earliest manuscripts where these were missing. And it said like Kingdom Come was missing at about 400 AD. That's one of the earliest manuscripts, and it names the manuscript. And the Give Us Our Daily Bread, that's in about the 11th century. So the 4th century AD, the 11th century is about when you start seeing these changes made, or what we call changes. And then I had to ask this question. I said, so by the way, how many Bible manuscripts exist? Now, these are ancient handwritten records that had some name or group associated with it that was a copy of the Bible that can be used as some, let me say this, there's no original manuscript. There's no earliest, like we don't get Matthew's pen or Paul's pen. We get a copy of a copy of a copy. We don't have anything that was the original handwritten letter by Paul or any of the people sharing their testimony of Jesus. So that's all we've got are copies of copies of copies. And so it lists in the Greek New Testament, there's about 5,900. The Latin Vulgate, there's over 10,000. You know, these are known books that people can put their hands on. Other ancient languages, Coptic, Syriac, Georgian. The Coptic is where the Enoch story originated from. About 15,000 of those. It goes through and it lists, and it says of these manuscripts, there's I'm sorry, it's on the bottom. 35 to 40,000. I put it on the top here. Physical manuscripts or fragments. So of the known Bible, there's a ton of things to pull from. And so I asked, so what did the King James pull from? One of these, two of these? And it states it used, excuse me, it used, maybe 10 or 11 of these to form its words. And so the point is that the King James was translated from a very tiny and very late subset of surviving manuscripts. They didn't go to the earliest ones. They went to later ones. If they had gone to earlier ones, they may have found certain words or many words different. But we have about 5,800 more Greek New Testament manuscripts since the King James was even written. So there's other sources to draw on. So some churches make a big deal saying, "Oh, the King James is the most authoritative." Well, it's a Bible. It's not necessarily more authoritative. It just used a certain number of manuscripts, and if you used other manuscripts, you could come up with different translation. That's how reliable and maybe unreliable it is that there were so many manuscripts to choose from. None of them were the original text, that you just had to pick and choose. So that's what happened. It was built on what we now know as this extremely small and relatively late slice of total evidence. So when we come back to the Lord's Prayer, I ask this final question. And I say, okay, let me ask a different question. If you take the RCE version of the Lord's Prayer, just face value, is there any Hebraic harmony that exists taking it at face value? Harmony that would not exist by keeping in the other inclusions. So those phrases that were omitted, you keep those out. You just look at the prayer. What does it tell you if you examine it from a Hebrew perspective? And this is what I thought was fascinating, even beyond some of these names and things we talked about earlier. Grok says this, AI says this. Yes, the RCE form, exactly as I shared, as I quoted, produces one, a perfect 7-line structure, which is a highly prized way of writing Hebrew poetry. 7 little lines. It produces an exclusively spiritual petition with no material request. And he said this is very Jewish, that you in a Jewish prayer, you wouldn't say, God, make sure I have bread to eat today. You wouldn't do that. You'd praise God for his mercy, you'd thank him for his goodness, but you wouldn't make that specific petition. And so it's saying by not having that in there, it's much more Jewish. Um, this the way it concludes, this doxology is nearly identical to First Chronicles 29:11 and the Kaddish, another Jewish book. And then it forms a tight chiasmus or inclusio where you kind of make a statement and then you end with the same statement, and you may repeat things in and out in reverse order. But it's saying that you get all these things that are very Hebrew by leaving out those phrases, which are included in the King James, but not in the RCE. So all 4 features are strengthened or made possible by the exact RCE omissions and inclusion of the doxology, the ending. In other words, it makes perfect Hebrew when you look at it as the RCE states.
So one of the just go back over that line 4 again, because I got a little lost and then I caught up. But it's so it says if the 2 missing lines are restored, the 2 lines being "Give us this day our daily bread" and "Thy kingdom come," right?
Right, right. And so the chiasmus or chiasm
Collapses if
it
those are true.
collapses. Right, right. You don't get it. It's not a perfect balance. But this, I'm going to study this more. This perfect 7-line structure. I'm kind of intrigued by that, just to find examples of that, because I bet we'll find more of those throughout the Book of Mormon. If we say, hey, let's search for 7-line structures in Hebrew poetry and try to find that, I bet they're there. And so,
So, and also that inclusion of the doxology has been, in Christian circles, that's kind of been pointed out that, well, this wasn't in the earliest manuscripts. It was a common ending that they would put on the end of a prayer. And so maybe it wasn't part of the original, but according to the Book of Mormon, it was part of the original and then got left out and then maybe got put back in, through the translation process. So it kind of clears up that debate if you take it at face value, as we're doing here, that and just look at the Book of Mormon's, the Lord's Prayer in its own, that it lines up better, and that the doxology was part of the original, even
yeah.
though there's this debate
And
there.
And it's like, who would have known by leaving those 2 phrases out, you get a more perfect Hebrew authentic prayer. Now, I'll say this too, because there's probably some people straining because I didn't really answer this, that like we have in the inspired version. Suffer us not to be led. I heard this growing up in churches. They said, well, if Joseph Smith was inspired to write "Suffer us not to be led," why does the Book of Mormon still say, "Lead us not into temptation"?
Right, as if God would never lead us into temptation. It was always the argument. God would never do that. The Bible's been recorded wrong, so let's
Exactly.
restore it.
Exactly. So what's interesting is this. Um, if we look at this now, notice what it says. So, what could the RCE version of the Lord's Prayer suggest about authenticity compared to other Bible versions? It would imply that Jesus originally taught a compact 7-line prayer with this chronicle style doxology. Thy kingdom come and the bread petition are later insertions. That's what it's implying. The doxology was original and later removed from the early Greek traditions. In other words, the RCE form presents itself as older than and structurally more Jewish than anything preserved in surviving New Testament manuscripts, while being unattested in any of them. In other words, it's saying it doesn't exist, but it proves itself to be more authentic. Wow. You
Mm.
know, and the critics wanted us to just ignore all of Jesus' words, saying, "Oh, they're just lifted from the Book of Mark or whatever. Don't pay any attention." But no, these subtle changes, which most of us never caught, are significant, and the fact that they're left out of the Book of Mormon is significant. Now, this part I just wanted to say, you said structurally more Jewish, and this is where I want to talk about this, lead us not into temptation, and just kind of close with this. I said, you said structurally more Jewish, and Grok says, yes, because of the sevenfold pattern, the absence of material petition, the Tanakh-based doxology, and the name Kingdom Inclusio, all hallmarks of the Second Temple Jewish liturgy. In other words, it's all authentic back into the days of the Second Temple. So why is it more Jewish to state, lead us not into temptation, instead of the Catholic version, suffer us not to be led into temptation? Now, right there, I know some of our listeners are going to take some offense that I said Catholic version. Suffer us not to be led was found in at least 4 different Catholic biblical commentaries in Joseph Smith's day. Now, we feel like, hey, suffer us not to be led had to be one of the most gentle, God-inspired things that Joseph Smith ever did for the Bible. Thank you, Joseph, for teaching us that God wouldn't lead us into temptation. But so my question is, so why does that exist in the King James or in the inspired version? One is that was borrowed from a Catholic manuscript, and here's the point. I remember being at a service one time when this very question came up, and Ray Treat was there, and he simply said, because lead us not into temptation already means that. He said it's a Hebrew idiom. He used that exact language. And this is what Grok says. Because lead us not into temptation is the literal blunt Semitic idiom still used daily by the Siddur, this Hebrew word. The softer Catholic phrasings of do not be led are later Western theological refinements to avoid implying that God actively tempts. The harsh, imperative, negative form is pure Hebrew style. In other words, lead us not into temptation, while it sounds harsh, it's pure Hebrew. And again, the Book of Mormon was translating into English words the very idioms that were used, and it doesn't always try to explain it. But again, it's a beautiful proof of itself. While we have the very Joseph Smith changing the Bible to say, suffer us not to be led into temptation, the fact is, that's not how the Hebrews said it. They understood from the idiom what it meant, just like we understand bite the bullet or kick the bucket or something like this. They understood what it meant, and we get the very words of the idiom preserved in the Book of Mormon. And so, again, it's another perfect internal proof of the authenticity of it, and our people don't get it because we're too quick to want to assume that anything Joseph Smith did was right and more correct than anything we have. And that's why we have so many people confused today, is because we've disregarded the Book of Mormon and all it teaches, and we've held on to truths that are just, as this states, Western theological refinements to avoid implying, God would tempt us, and among other things. And so this is, to me, I think it's a beautiful explanation that the Book of Mormon is everything it says it is. It's simply a translation from original Egyptian words representing Hebraic thought, and there's much, much more we can learn from this.
So, can you go back to the actual prayer in the Book of Mormon, the Lord's Prayer?
Yeah, it's right here.
So I wonder.
It's set aside.
Yeah, so I wonder, people would say, well, isn't that important? Thy kingdom come. That why taking that out, doesn't that diminish the prayer? I don't know. In the end, it says, "Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." But I guess it's just something we're used to hearing there.
Oh yeah, and if I suppose in the end, whether we pray for it or not, his kingdom is coming. I mean, he's returning to the earth. But when you look at it without it, and I'm no scholar to be able to comment on it, but it's just so much more concise. Our Father, your name is holy. May your will be done. Please forgive us and our debtors. It's making everyone common here. It's not asking for anything in return. And if I do this, would you feed me, please? It doesn't do this. It's just saying, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Forgive our debts and our debtors. You see the parallelism here. His name is holy. may your holiness be our will to do. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You get these parallels all through here: earth and heaven, our debts and our debtors, our temptation and deliverance, because it's Him and it's about Him and His power and His glory. I don't know. I I don't want to believe it just because I'm seeing what Grok has to say, but I'm realizing that these words don't have place in the conciseness of the original prayer. And if we examine this deeply, I think we're going to find more parallels to this in the Book of Mormon that teach us, about this 7-line compact style of poetry.
Yeah, when it's talking about thy will be heaven, I mean that is literally the kingdom being here with us, or we could say as the Holy Spirit is able to take up residence within us, then the kingdom is with us personally, and as a body of people allows the Spirit to take up residence within them, then the kingdom has come to that group of people, and then so on as the earth falls into submission under God, then His kingdom is here, and we're obeying and submitting to Him and not to other things that or not bowing our will to Him, I should say. So
Yep.
it's the same concept still is still in this concise one over here on the right.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I've had a lot of we've heard a lot of debates on the Lord's Prayer and why it's different and it's missing, and it's plagiarized over the doxology that really wasn't there originally. So why wouldn't Jesus have said it, without that being there? And just this is another viewpoint to all of that, which I think adds to the validity of the book.
Yeah, it sure does. And so, I don't know, maybe one time I should do a little bit deeper dive for the podcast on this. Suffer us not to be led. But what we find, and this is the harsh reality, is that Adam Clark, who wrote a commentary, there's been discovered like up to 200 changes in the inspired version that were actually part of Adam Clark's writings. We find that suffer us not to be led. This is something that Catholics have said. I even have an article from the Pope about 15 years ago where he makes this very statement, which I thought at the time was a beautiful explanation of the inspired version. I was thinking it was pointing to the inspired version's validity. I had no idea at the time that Joseph Smith was put under pressure. He was asked by others to translate the Bible because they figured he had the power to do so. But what he ended up doing, unfortunately, was spending a lot of his quiet hours reading other manuscripts and finding the good words in there. Maybe Hiram and others found these. And so he starts compiling these notes. Well, if God had commanded him to translate the Bible to remove some of the errors, he didn't get it done in his lifetime. And I look at these people in the Book of Mormon who God did give commands, and they did get it done. Mormon wrote everything up into the title page, and Moroni just finishes a few things that were given in letters. But if God gives a command, He also gives you the ability to finish it. And it was never a finished work. I know the LDS Church holds it to some degree, but they don't promote it like they still want promote. The JST isn't promoted like the King James version. I don't know. I used to just think the inspired version was the best version out there, but anymore I've realized they're all flawed. They've all got some error, and where we find the truth to settle these issues that come from the errors is the Book of Mormon, and it's going to give us the truth we need for now.
Well, thanks, brother. Another episode full of fascinating facts, faith strengthening things that we can share with family members maybe that have walked away from the church and thrown the Book of Mormon out, along with everything else that we found to be maybe not from heaven as we thought, but was the traditions of men. And I hope these are things that can maybe give some of those people a chance to ponder and maybe take that Book of Mormon off the shelf and look at that as a legitimate, miraculous gift given to us in these last days. And that, as Satan always does, he tries to cover up that plain truth with prophets and infallibility and, communal living and misinterpretations of Zion and all kinds of other things that just muddy the waters of this very plain, simple book that gives us a map on how to allow God to interact with us and how we interact with him, and allow our hearts to be changed, that we arrive one day at that point of having no more disposition to do evil, but only wanting to be submissive to God and Jesus and his ways.
Amen. Amen.
Well, take us out, brother.
I think you just did. But, that this way is clear and it's straight and it is narrow. But I believe when we hold on to the Book of Mormon, we will all be walking each other home.
Till next time, God bless and be kind to each other. Thank you.